So I guess I've had the opportunity to sit in some of the presentations this afternoon. So you've probably heard a lot about what the attack surface looks like and some of the challenges. So I'm going to approach this whole thing slightly differently and think about how do we as organizations protect ourselves. We've had some presentations from some other vendors this afternoon, and we've talked about things like SIEM and security analytics. But really, there is no one answer, and I think for all of you here in the room, you probably know that. We know that organizations continue to spend budget on security, but we also know that breaches continue to occur. So clearly, we're actually not getting something right there. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But really, for organizations to detect attacks before you have any real damage, you constantly need to scour your IT environment for some really subtle signs of activity. We know that some of the traditional tools that we have probably aren't good enough for us anymore. And I'm going to talk about cyber hunting, and hunting's probably not necessarily a new thing. I think for those of you who work in a SOC environment, for example, then you probably are doing a lot of the hunting things I'm going to talk about. So for example, if you've had a hunch and you've investigated something, then you probably have been doing some hunting in the context of what I'm going to talk about. So if you think about, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone with my hunting analogy, by the way. But I think when we think about security, then gone are the days where we actually waited around for actually an alert to appear before we actually did something with it. And all too often, a lot of organizations still work in that environment where they're actually waiting for an event or an alert to come up before they actually scramble up their incident response team and think, we need to do something about this. We know it's too late by then, because that means that the compromise is already there. So we obviously need to think a lot more like the attackers. We need to communicate where the attackers communicate. We need to think about, if you were an attacker or an adversary, then what are the boundaries that you would test in an organization and actually spend a lot of time there? Where would you go to? So for example, if you're doing forensics or investigating a compromise, then the sort of places that you would typically go to would be at the end of the kill chain. So if you think about command and control, act on objectives, by that time, it's too late for you as an organization, but typically that's where you see the most footprints as well. That's typically where adversaries leave the biggest footprints. So that's quite often a place to start. So one of the things about hunting is really thinking about if you were the attacker, where would you go and what sort of things would you be doing? And again, for those of you in the room, if you had somebody in your environment today who has got in with stolen credentials, would you be able to find them? And that's quite an interesting thought process to go through, to think about, what tools and capabilities do you have today to be able to identify that. So many of you might have seen a version of this before. And this is typically what we talk about, the anatomy of an attack. So what does an actual attack look like? So going back to basics. Now, I do a lot of workshops with customers on this, and if you think about it, it's fairly obvious what we need to do. It's a bit like, being told to eat your 5 fruit and veg a day, or is it 7? I can't remember. But many of us probably don't. So I think when you think about the anatomy of an attack, there's 2 things that we need to do, really, 2 goals that we need to remember. The first one is to shrink the dwell time. So this is a timer from when the attack is identified to you actually doing, from the attack start to when you actually find it, and then speeding up your response time. So the 2 windows are the 2 things that we should focus on. But as you'll see, we're actually not doing a very good job when it comes to doing that, and that's why we still continue to see some of the breaches that I'm talking about. So if you think about those 2 goals, then you've actually heard a little earlier this afternoon in this room about incident detection and incident response. And I think when it comes to cyber hunting, then the whole incident detection and incident response starts to play in a really strong way, because that's one of the things, if you think about shrinking that dwell time down, the only way you can do that is you have to have comprehensive monitoring tools, you have to have visibility, you have to know what's going on in your network, and if you can do that, that's your incident detection. So you need to be thinking more about the monitoring tools. And then for incident response, and I'll talk about this, you obviously need to have comprehensive incident response plans to help you respond to some of the compromises that you may see in your environment. So it's obvious what we need to do, right? We've just said 2 very simple goals. But we found in some research that we've done, I've just got a few slides on what the reality is, how good or how bad we're doing. So you can see from this one that in terms of breach readiness, 55% of organizations lack the capability to gather data. So if they're actually not collecting data, so they're not monitoring, then they have no idea on that dwell time. They can't really act to do anything on that dwell time. Vulnerability management is an interesting one because it's not new. You know, for those of us who've been in security for many years, like me, you know, vulnerability management is one of the first things that we think about when we think about cybersecurity. But actually, we still don't do a good enough job of it, and it's not an easy thing to do. And most organizations struggle with it. But you can see that, you know, we're still not doing a good enough job. And the last one is interesting. So incident response, we talked about that second goal. So 30% do not have an incident response plan. And interestingly, of the ones who did, they've never actually exercised the incident response plan. And I quite often think of them as fire drills. You know, if you had a fire drill anywhere in your workplace, in your home, you typically know what to do because it's something that's rehearsed. But for incident response plans, organizations really don't spend enough time in understanding and actually practicing what needs to happen. Similarly, again, some of our research, you can see that organizations typically, won't go through all the numbers, aren't satisfied with either the data that they're collecting or how quickly they can respond to it. Now, obviously, if they're not collecting the right data, then their ability to respond is also compromised. And interestingly, the last one there about behavior analytics. User behavior analytics is one of the... In this survey, we also asked organizations what tools and capabilities they have today, what they're planning to invest in the future, and how satisfied they are with some of the tools and capabilities they have today. So the user behavior analytics was one area that the people that we surveyed said would spend a lot more of their budget on in the coming years. So that's interesting that the whole machine learning and the behavior analytics is going to play a really big part. I've kind of touched on some of this. So obviously, if you don't have the ability to detect threats, you can see very few organizations do, and very few organizations are satisfied with it. So this particular survey is something called the Poverty Index. And for those, it's actually based on NIST. And for those of you in the room, if you're interested, if you go onto our website and do the survey yourself, you'll actually get a report back from us to actually show you how you actually compare to the NIST standard. So, you know, where you sit in terms of your capabilities. It's quite a good exercise to do to see where you are today and some of the steps that you might need to take to get to the NIST standards. So that's about the survey. But what about what we're spending? So we know that probably about 80% of an organization's budget actually goes on prevention tools. But we've already said the prevention tools aren't necessarily the answer today, because we know that most of the attacks we see today tend to be advanced threats, so highly resourced, highly targeted, and probably malware that's been created within a few hours and used, so there is no signature. So prevention tools, although we still need to use some of them, we don't need to spend 80% of our budget on it. But if we're spending 80% of our budget on it, then actually we're not spending anything or very little on monitoring and response. So thinking about how we allocate that budget, not necessarily more budget, but thinking about spending more on detection and response and less on prevention. So the numbers you see up there are from one of the Gartner's reports. And you can see the 5% actually scares me, that organizations don't even know today what that split is between what they spend on prevention and anything else. But the good news is that they see that that's going to change because organizations are beginning to realize that whole detection and response relationship needs to be much stronger. So why is this so difficult? A bit of a history lesson, I guess. If you think about cybersecurity and very simple hacks, then typically that's where we all started implementing security controls. So we started implementing things like antivirus, firewalls, IDS, IPS, to try and stop some of those hacks or the simple attacks that we saw. Now, we could prevent some of those attacks, but obviously that still left a huge white space, because for businesses to continue to do their business, they still need to have some ports open for traffic to come in and out of the organization. So that white space is effectively exploited by the adversaries to try and attack an organization. So that's kind of, the first stage. Then we started thinking about more sophisticated attacks. So this time we perhaps started to see attacks that were using stolen credentials or new exploits or something like that. And SIM started to be around, I guess, in the last 10 years or so. So SIM did a good job to an extent, because you were actually capturing a lot of that log data, so you could actually do something with it. But the problem with SIM is that typically it only collects data from preventative tools, so all the tools that we talked about, but that doesn't necessarily help you with some of the more sophisticated attacks, because the more sophisticated attacks attack the white space that's actually between some of those layers. And we know that every bit of white space that's between the layers is actually could be a vulnerability. So SIM did some of the work, but possibly not all of it. So if we think about some of the sophisticated attacks, the advanced threat that I was talking about, and what we really need to think about is something like security analytics, because that actually helps you to see what's going on in your network. So you have complete visibility all the way from endpoint through to the network, through to your applications, and also looking at full packet capture. There's no point in just looking at an envelope. You really need to look what's inside the envelope to give you that full visibility. So security analytics basically looks at everything, that whole stack that I'm talking about, and it's the only way that you can actually shut down all the white space that exists in your environment. So if we're going to catch our prey, and think about the two goals that we had, the incident detection and incident response, then if you were hunting, then these are some of the things that you would typically need to do. So for example, if you were hunting deer, then you would perhaps look at maps to see where their normal habitat is. You'd to see what their past successes were with that. You may have some cameras that give you some data. But really, you get the picture. You need to understand your whole environment. So, and try and gather as much information as you can to make sure that from a hunting perspective, you are successful when you actually go out and catch those deer. So from a cybersecurity perspective, it's a very similar analogy, I guess, when it comes to cyber hunting. So the first thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that if you're hunting, then data is critical and visibility is critical. So organizations really need to think about how much visibility do we have in our environment. So how much data are we collecting? And I mentioned that earlier, all the way from endpoints through your application, through your transactions, and actually even looking at transactions and identity. If someone's doing something in an application, then is whatever they're doing, is whatever their identity is doing, is that appropriate for their identity based on your policies and procedures you may have? So you really need to collect all that data. Now, if you're collecting all that data, you're obviously going to have more data than you know what to do with, and we know that lots of data isn't necessarily a good thing unless you can actually do something with it. So what can you do with it? Well, you can apply data science to it, so you can apply without having data scientists. We've built in modules to actually help you make some of those decisions in terms of data science. You can apply security analytics to it, so you can analyze that data to say, okay, we've got all these things that are coming into us. What are the, out of the thousands that we see, what are the 50 or 100 that we actually need to do something with? Incidentally, in our own cert in EMC, we have something like 66 million incidents or logs that we see every hour. Now, you'll find that obviously the more you monitor, the more information you do get. Now, obviously, we can't respond to that many events. But to help you do that, there are lots of either data science modules in security analytics, or you can have policies and procedures to help you do that. And I'll talk about some of the standard things that are available to help you do that. So that's the first thing. We've got the visibility, and we're collecting the data. We also, earlier presentations in the room talked about threat intelligence. Now, threat intelligence is a really useful tool if it's the right threat intelligence. So I think there's two things. The first thing is that you need to have threat intelligence internally. You need to know your business. You need to know, what your critical assets are, how you're protecting that, and also, who from the outside, what are your risks? So, who would want the information that you have within your organization? So that's the first thing. If you're subscribing to external threat intelligence, then make sure that's relevant to your business, and that should really be used to augment what you have internally to give you that real-time threat detection. So you can say, okay, if it's this vulnerability, how quickly can you say, well, do we have that vulnerability in our environment, and how quickly can we patch those machines, or whatever it is that you need to do to shut that vulnerability down. So I think if you can automate that, consuming that third-party threat intelligence, and quickly make some of those changes, then that's really important. And automation actually is another key thing. If you're monitoring a lot more, and if you're collecting all that data, then yes, you do have a lot of data. So obviously, automation plays a really key part here. So if you have to do something more than once, then you should try and automate it, particularly in a SOC environment, so that you start getting to a point where you actually start creating maturity models. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works as well in a moment. I think somebody asked a question in the room earlier about by having some of these tools, are we saying that we don't need analysts anymore? I think we'll always need analysts, but actually all of these tools help the analysts to actually focus on what is important. So focus on what it is that they should be focusing on, rather than firefighting or being reactive all the time and looking at all the large number of incidents that are coming in. So providing the right tools and providing the right priorities, and part of that is context. And context is very much about looking at the risks based on a business perspective. And I think a lot of organizations from a security perspective are relatively mature. So from an IT security perspective, they're quite mature. So they may know that they have a compromise and it's on a file server, and they may know the IP address of that file server. But if they had to make a decision to say, shut that server down immediately, and know what impact shutting that server down would have on the rest of the business risk, then typically that correlation is very difficult to make. So when I'm talking about context, I'm talking about that glue that sits between IT risk and business risk. So if you're using something like security analytics, you're also using some of the analysis tools, and actually helps you to create the right priorities, to say, okay, based on the business risk, we need to address these priorities. So it helps the SOC team be more effective. I talked about behavior earlier. As you know, it's one of the things that organizations are saying they're going to spend a larger number of their budget on in the coming year. And I've talked about context. So when you think about incident detection, incident response, basic security is about three things, right? We know that: people, process, and technology. So from a technology perspective, I've talked about security analytics, but from a people perspective, obviously the people or the team that you have in your SOC, in your CERT, whatever you call it, we call ours a CERT, means that they all have different roles to play. And again, if you look at maturing organizations, then they actually have people who have roles like tier 1, triage, reverse malware engineering. So they have specific roles that they are responsible for, and they're also measured. So if you have roles like that, then you measure them based on quality and quantitative methods to make sure that they're actually maturing your security implementations all the time. So there's some kind of capability maturity model that helps you do that. Another important aspect of the team is that when you think about incident response or breach readiness, then we know from our research that a lot of organizations don't spend a lot of time actually practicing it. So in the same way that you think about whatever sport that you may be into, then typically if you take your practice seriously and you perform well in practice, then actually you probably perform very well in the game. So a lot of maturing organizations tend to run breach readiness exercises both in-house and maybe even get third parties to come and assess them, so they actually understand where their perhaps strengths and weaknesses are and where they can actually improve in terms of that whole environment. The third aspect of it is the process piece, I guess. And you'll find that once you start having a mature team of people, then how they operate in a SOC environment becomes really important as well. So, and I talked about, we can't actually wait for an incident to happen and then say, okay, let's get our incident response team going now. So if you're getting to that right maturity level, then a lot of those incidents should continuously flow through your whole environment so that you always have something coming in, you're responding to it, and it's actually going out. And by doing that, you're actually building up your maturity level. And of course, there are lots of best practices out there, and some of you may be familiar with these, or you may be using it. So things like NIST, you've got on there, you've got various SANS Institute, also have some best practices. And it's a lot about using the right language, so using a common language to actually describe what's happening in the environment, but also by using that common language, you're actually maturing as an organization when it comes to incident response as well. So this is an interesting analogy. I think if you're in security and you have to get extra budget or try and justify spending money on security, it's always difficult, right? Nobody's agreeing with me. That means you obviously have lots of budget. But typically, organizations really struggle to be able to justify budget when they're actually trying to spend it on security. And this is some of the things that I've talked about are actually a really good methodology. And albeit I've simplified it a lot, but it's a really good methodology to actually start thinking about how can you justify budget, and actually how can you show progress for the business. So not just about IT security, but actually how can you demonstrate progress from a business risk perspective. So if we look at the steps that we've got there and say that, we start with visibility. So, we know we're collecting all the security issues and we have good visibility. So now that we can see what's going on in our environment and we apply some analytics to it, then actually the right priorities come up, because you know that if you had a compromise on a file server, you had the IP address of the file server, and it may be a file server, if you're a financial services organization, it might be a file server that's really critical to your business, obviously the priority is really high for that. So once you apply the analytics, the right priorities actually come up, and you can actually action those. Once you action the right priority, you're actually getting some results, because now you can demonstrate the fact that from a business risk perspective, you're actually addressing the right priorities that are important to the business. And then if you think about doing that as a cycle, so continuously feeding in what you're actually learning, so looking at a capability maturity model, then actually you start getting some real metrics out of some of the things that you're doing in security. And I think metrics in security are really important as well. So not only metrics in a SOC environment, but if you had to report to the board or just to the C-level in terms of what the level of security is, or what the level of risk is as a business, that's typically quite difficult to do from a business perspective. And this kind of model actually helps you to build some of that, to actually get to the right priorities and the right metrics. So just one of my final slides. For those of you who, I'll just hold it, it's easier. So for those of you who might be interested in looking at a maturity model for incident detection and incident response, and you can see something I've got up there on the slide, and that's actually from one of the white papers that we at RSA have got. And it's a really good, this is a very small snapshot, but you can see that only 10% of organizations are in the key four. So they're the ones who are actually mature, if you like, when it comes to incident detection and response. But it's, again, a really good place to go to see where you are as an organization on that chart. And then it's a fairly detailed paper, so it actually tells you what are some of the steps that you would need to take, so to move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So to get to key force, it might give you a list of 20 things that you would need to do. So again, from a planning perspective for you as an organization, it actually helps you to get to that high level of maturity. And I think that might be my last slide. So that is my last slide. Got time for questions?
Yes, just Thank you very much. We are running 12 minutes behind schedule, but we will have time for some questions. Just a few, perhaps. If somebody wants to ask one, maybe? No? Yes?
That's two.
Okay.
Procedure from RSA, if you don't mind. What is your most prevalent product capability now that you offer to customers? What do the customers now need? And also, for your customers and your reports and your researching, etc., which of the threats do you think you still find is most difficult to deal with and typically needs a segregated SOC team?
Okay. So two questions there. The first one was, from an RSA perspective, what are our key capabilities and what are our strongest products, I suppose. And the second question was, from all our research, what are the most difficult things that organizations find to do. So to answer the first question, I think there's three key capabilities that organizations need to think about. So I've primarily been talking about security analytics. So that's one thing. So that's having the visibility, being able to analyze the data and make the right decisions. So that's one area. The two other capabilities that matter the most today, the first one is identity. Identity is something that so many organizations struggle with. If you think about our attack surface, if you think about how we do business today, then identity is really challenging. So identity is one of those. And then the third one is the whole aspect of business risk. So based on governance, risk and compliance. So our Archer solution, which is very much about the glue, if you like, that I talked about, from IT risk to business risk. So how do you make the right decisions based on what's happening in your business and the security. So I think 3 areas, so identity, security analytics, and governance, risk and compliance with ARTA. And then to answer your second question, it varies, I think, in terms of what are the most difficult things, but some of the most difficult things are the easiest things or the oldest things that we've been playing with. So malware. Malware is probably the most difficult one, I guess, that we come across all the time. And if you look at probably 80%, I'm guessing probably about 80% of the attacks that we see out there are malware. And I think companies kind of struggle with how to do that. The other area that we find quite often is some of the oldies. If you look at something like, Configure, how many years has it been around? 8? Maybe 8, 9? I don't know, something like that. But it's still something that's, probably got the highest vulnerability. It's the one that's the most exploited. So I think some of the older things, some of the basic things that we should be doing are probably the things that we're probably not doing. And if we do some of those things, then we can probably eliminate maybe a huge portion of the attacks that we see. And the reality is that, we talk about advanced attacks. There are advanced attacks, but if you look at the numbers purely from the really easy stuff to the more complicated, there aren't that many of them. So, we really need to get our house in order from doing some of those basics.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashmi Knowles RSA.